So first of all, thank you all for having me here tonight. I do have a microphone on, but it's for the recording in the back. I am going to try my best to project as loud as I can. I know the acoustics in this room can be really weird. I gave pretty much 57 Rhodes Scholar tours a week for about 2 years in here. So I do have some experience with the room, but if I ever need to speak up, please let me know. But I'm really excited to give this talk tonight. And for almost as long as they have been named St. Simon's and Jekyll Island, these two close neighbors, seen here on a county map from 1912, have had a relationship that changes almost as soon as it's defined. One island has often supported the other with crops and supplies and has welcomed visitors from its counterpart to its shores by boat or by causeway. The short distance between us has, as Bruce kind of alluded to here, sustained a complicated web. I can still read, I promise. That's perfect. Of familial and marital relationships that connect us through shared family names, claims to land, and generations-long stories that make the history of this area so unique and fascinating. Just as often, though, we have been rivals. With Jekyll's coastline so visible from St. Simon's and vice versa, it's easy to compare. Who's visiting? Whose skyline is changing? And just what is going on over there? Neither of us have ever been the kind to be outdone. If one of us changes, the other doesn't necessarily follow the exact same path, but you can be sure that there's something in the works, preparing to rival whatever new shiny thing the other island has. At the end of it all, yes, I do think we're friends, but friends with a comparative, if not a slightly competitive streak. This relationship, I think, began when two of our earliest and best-known representatives got off on, shall we say, the wrong foot. Each had been summoned by James Oglethorpe himself, and their sour relationship began even before they stepped foot on Georgian soil. In 1735, on board the ship Simmond or Simmons on its voyage across the Atlantic, the brothers Charles and John Wesley, John is pictured here, hoped to solidly establish their new religious movement, Methodism, even before they arrived at Frederica. They were none too pleased to find that they shared a ship with many German dissenters, as they were called, who practiced their own religion and refused to attend the Wesleys' twice-daily prayer services. The Wesley brothers felt that they simply could not abide the unruly behavior of this group. They complained directly to Oglethorpe, who took their concerns seriously. He even put one woman ashore for drinking and indecent behavior before the ship arrived in Georgia. Unluckily for the Wesley brothers, this woman was also employed by William Horton, a military aide to Oglethorpe and the soon-to-be overseer of Frederica itself. Horton knew who to blame for the loss of his employee, and he made his newfound contempt for the Wesley brothers extremely clear. John Wesley wrote that same night, Horton awakened the brothers by dancing on the deck over our heads, he said. Horton later seemed to regret the restless night he gave the Wesleys, and John wrote that Horton had begged pardon the next day. All of this would seem settled, but this did not end the conflict between Horton and the Wesleys. Despite that gentlemanly apology, Horton still seemed suspicious of the brothers and their religious motives once they had arrived in Georgia. The Wesleys sensed that Horton was important to win over, and they made efforts to do that, but Horton remained closed off and rebuffed their attempts. He ultimately seemed to see John Wesley as kind of a meddler and a gossip. Wesley, for his part, had eventually had enough of the tension, and he went directly to to Horton, and openly asked him why he was so cold towards him. John wrote down this entire encounter in his journal and said that Horton was more than ready to answer. This is a direct quote from that journal. Horton told Wesley, "I like nothing you do. All your sermons are satires upon particular persons. Therefore, I will never hear you more, and all the people are of my mind, for we won't hear ourselves abused. Besides, they say, they are Protestants. But as for you, they cannot tell what religion you are of. They never heard of such a religion before. They do not know what to make of it. And then your private behavior. All the quarrels that have been here since you came have been long of you. Indeed, there is neither man nor woman in the town who minds a word you say, and so you may preach long enough, but nobody will come to hear you." Has anyone ever seen an episode of that show, The Office, where Michael says to someone, "I like nothing about you," kind of along the same lines? That's what that encounter always reminds me of. John Wesley noted that Horton looked eager for an answer, but Wesley wrote that he had nothing to do but thank him for his openness and walk away. It was no wonder that Wesley felt compelled to leave the colony of Georgia only 2 years after he arrived. Being disliked by the common people about town was one matter, but being disliked by Major William Horton was especially significant. As military aide to Oglethorpe and the commander of the garrison at Frederica, Horton was a respected presence within the new colony. For his service at Frederica, he had also been granted land here on Jekyll Island, where he built the Horton House, which I'm hoping looks familiar to everyone, and several other structures in the 1740s. At times, his land on Jekyll served to support the soldiers at Fort Frederica. Horton raised cattle and horses here and grew crops, both food staples and plants for further processing like hops and barley. His brewery, the first in Georgia, also supplied Frederica with much of its beer. Despite his attitude toward the Wesleys, Horton could also be a fine host when he wanted to. In 1738, the year of Georgia's official founding, Horton welcomed a man named William Stevens, the new colonial secretary, to Frederica. Horton wasn't actually there at Frederica when Stevens arrived, but the distance between the town and his house on Jekyll was short enough that a signal gun could summon him from one to the other. He greeted Stevens on St. Simon's, then proceeded to take him on a days-long tour of the area, visiting Fort Frederica, Fort St. Andrews on Cumberland Island, and ending on Horton's property on Jekyll. Stevens had nothing but positive things to say about Horton's property, to which he said considerable improvements had been made, and his hospitality. Later, Stevens wrote that Horton would not allow our party to depart without dining with him, which I perceived he had made some provision for, and we fared well. Soldiers and residents at Frederica perhaps saw Jekyll as simply a support for their much larger population. It was where the person in charge lived, and it sometimes provided needed supplies, but it also had one other role. It was the beginning of the true frontier borderlands of the English colonies, the last defense and warning against Spanish invasion. Although Frederica housed the military might of the British, Jekyll also served as an important symbol of the British presence in the area. Horton used his property on Jekyll as a diplomatic outpost. He hosted Spanish ambassadors from St. Augustine first on board the ship Hawke, anchored in the Sound, and then as his first official guests on Jekyll in late June 1736. This short visit gave the Spanish the outward appearance of English hospitality, but Horton also intended their stay on Jekyll to prevent them from learning the extent or the limits of Fort Frederica's military strength. Despite further English military presence in the area, the Spanish were determined to make an inroad here. One of their most significant attempts occurred several years after their diplomatic visit to Jekyll, resulting in what would be called the Battle of Bloody Marsh on this site, where it's kind of hard to see anything significant about it from this postcard if it weren't for the title at the bottom. On July 5th, 1742, the Spanish entered the Sound and took Fort St. Simon's, near where the St. Simon's Lighthouse and my office is today. The famous battle occurred as the Spanish made their way toward Frederica, and although losses and the numbers of English troops gathered at the fort were relatively small, the Spanish were spooked. Major Horton had heard the news and arrived at just the right moment, driving the Spanish quickly off St. Simon's. In revenge, the Spanish just as quickly made their way to Jekyll, where Horton's property was abandoned and ripe for the taking, or maybe just for the destroying. They burned the original Horton House and many outbuildings, they destroyed the supplies that had often supported Frederica, and then they beat a hasty retreat back to Florida. Interestingly, June Hall McCash refers to the Spanish forces' destruction of Horton's property on Jekyll as the last hostile action of the Spanish army in Georgia, showcasing Jekyll's importance as a borderland and as a symbol of the wider English colony. With the Spanish threat reduced, if not entirely neutralized, the roles of Jekyll and St. Simon's began to change. As Georgia solidified its colonial presence, the military importance of both islands continued, although this importance shifted in the wake of the deactivation of Oglethorpe's 42nd Regiment at Frederica in 1749. For years before, Frederica had been the center of both islands' lives, with resources on both St. Simon's and Jekyll helping to support the town. Now, each island had its own significant military population to support. After William Horton's death in 1747, Jekyll came under the leadership of a pair of brothers, Paul and Raymond Demery, who had served at Frederica until the 42nd Regiment's deactivation. There are very scarce images of the Demery brothers. So the image I have here is of historian Margaret Davis Kate. She's showcasing a display of artifacts from the brothers' homestead at Frederica. The Demery brothers had both taken part in the Battle of Bloody Marsh and had previously served Horton as interpreters in Spanish Florida. The ultimate English victory over the Spanish in 1742 is sometimes credited to their presence at the battle. Soldiers like the Demerys were given the choice to remain in Georgia as settlers with a grant of 50 acres, or to re-enlist in what was called an independent company. The Demerys were among the few who chose the second option, and in 1749, Paul received his assignment. He would oversee a group of about 14 men stationed on Jekyll Island. His brother Raymond would take over his position a little bit more than a year later. William Horton had farmed his grant of 500 acres on Jekyll Island and made improvements to the property, helping to support Frederica, but neither he nor those he employed was ever noted for any special skill or zeal for cultivating the land. In contrast, Raymond Demery was often praised for the obvious care he put into maintaining Horton's buildings and farming his land on Jekyll. Demery also kept a large plantation on St. Simon's, Harrington Hall, which was visited by William Logan, a member of Georgia's Governor's Council, in 1749. Logan described Demery's holdings on St. Simon's as in a very poor, flat, sandy spot, but stocked with young trees like peaches, apples, oranges, and pomegranates. Later generations of the Demery family continued to hold land on St. Simon's with a South End plantation named Mulberry Grove. Despite the increased military presence, Jekyll and St. Simon's still had one key difference. On maps, St. Simon's was solidly within the borders of the British colony of Georgia, while Jekyll was more in a state of transition. By the Revolution, it would be considered as essentially a part of Georgia as its northern neighbor. As late as 1756, though, the still changing border of Georgia seemed to run straight through the Sound, at least cartographically. This map, drawn in that year by William de Brom, does not include Jekyll in what it calls the inhabited part of Georgia. In fact, anything south of what he labeled the Great St. Simon's Sound down here and the town of Frederica seems to have not even been included on his map. If Jekyll, compared to St. Simon's, didn't at this point feel completely part of the English colony, though, its next changes of ownership would change that perception completely. The two loyalist families that would own Jekyll Island, the Martins and the Leakes, also established a network of familial and marital relationships with St. Simon's that would set the tone for the two islands' relationship over the next century. The Leakes and the Martins were interrelated themselves. The patriarch Richard Leake was the brother-in-law of the former owner John Martin. In November of 1795, Richard Leake's daughter, whose name was Sally, married a St. Simon's native named Thomas Spalding, whose father James was one of the first planters on the island to experiment with Sea Island cotton. Although Thomas and Sally Spalding would later make their home on Sapelo Island, their marriage was an early harbinger of more change in the relationship between and status of St. Simon's and Jekyll Islands. After Richard Leake's sale of Jekyll in 1791, the physical gap between Jekyll and St. Simon's would also mark the transition between kind of an English and a French-speaking world. Leake had sold the island to a man named, and although my last name is French, you might have to forgive my pronunciations here for a minute. Are we ready? His name was François-Marie Loy Dumousset de la Veuve, I think. But its most prominent French residents, the Dubignons, would shortly arrive, along with friends and family members that would make Jekyll a significant French outpost. Still, they also built relationships with fellow planter families on St. Simon's, including the Cooper and the Spalding families. Just as these relationships were interconnected, so was the land ownership. Patriarch Christophe Dubignon's holdings were not limited to Jekyll. He and his family also spent time at his properties in Savannah, in mainland Brunswick, and near Frederica on St. Simon's. Just like the Leakes before them, the Dubignon family also saw opportunities for matchmaking in their relationships with St. Simon's families. One day in 1804, when Christophe made the trip across the Sound to John Cooper's Cannons Point plantation, he met a visitor there who would become involved with his family for the rest of her life. Originally from Bordeaux in France, Anne Amelia Nicolau, on the left here, had come to St. Simon's after her parents were killed in the Haitian Revolution. Interestingly, her visit to Cannons Point overlapped with Aaron Burr's visit to Major Pierce Butler's plantation very close to Cannons Point. although they were there for very different reasons, since Aaron Burr was kind of hiding out since he had just shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. Following the loss of her parents and one of her brothers, with another brother desperately ill, Anne Amelia was in a delicate situation when she first met Christophe. Christophe, though, was immediately charmed by her, and he proposed her as a match for either of his sons, Joseph or Henri. Legend states that he flatly offered her either of his sons in marriage within kind of minutes of first meeting her. Although that may not have been the case, Anne Amelia did marry Henri Dubignon in 1808, and the couple received 40 acres of land and 10 enslaved people on Jekyll Island for their use. Anne Amelia and Henri Dubignon would have 9 children together. One of them, John Cooper Dubignon, was named for Anne Amelia's benefactor on the right here, and one of the couple's matchmakers. The Dubignon family and their property on Jekyll were the center of a wide-ranging web of social connections who often came to call. Through the years, the family built a French-speaking group of friends and neighbors on Jekyll, a group that eventually branched out to St. Simons as well, leaving its mark on the area. French speakers bound for the Dubignon plantation, like Louis Grand-Dutré, often stopped on St. Simons, especially at Frederica, before they reached their ultimate destination. Dutré wrote to his mother in January 1809 that the Dubignons were eager to see him and perhaps even more eager to potentially have him stay permanently on Jekyll. He wrote, "The Dubignons are urging me to settle on Jekyll. They're offering me a conveniently located house on their wharf to keep a store, and they would put up half of the necessary capital to set it up. They're offering me besides as much land as I could cultivate." Dutré didn't stay on Jekyll permanently, despite the generous offer, but he did remain in the area, where his descendants would intermarry with both the Dubignon and the Nicolau families. This was a common story. Even if a person or family declined permanent residence on Jekyll, their association with the Dubignons was pleasant enough to keep up contact on a permanent basis. One of the strongest examples of this was the family of Alexander Campbell Wiley, who lived on Jekyll for more than 5 years, but eventually left for the opportunity to set up the St. Clair plantation in the village area of St. Simons. Despite the newfound distance, the Wileys kept up their association with the Dubignons and Jekyll after their move, and if you've ever driven on Captain Wiley Road, you've seen the evidence of that relationship that continues today. This friendly relationship between neighbors, and just as often in-laws, nieces, nephews, and grandchildren, also meant a willingness to protect what both islands' populations saw as each other's rights, well-being, and property. During the War of 1812, the HMS Lacedaemonian, a British frigate, made its way through Georgia's intercoastal waterways. Area residents had seen British ships nearby since 1807, and many feared a possible invasion. On St. Simons, Butler Plantation overseer Roswell King wrote a fearful letter to Pierce Butler in 1814, saying, "We have no one to defend our coast. A boat can land from anywhere from here to Cumberland and take what they please." The HMS Lacedaemonian realized those fears when the ship landed on Jekyll in November 1814. Like the Spanish had done after the Battle of Bloody Marsh, British sailors destroyed property, stole items from the Dubignons' house, and left the island with about 28 enslaved people who went with them willingly. In the wake of the event, Christophe Dubignon's local connections on Cumberland and St. Simons formally attested to the loss of his property, hoping to gain compensation for their friend. Dubignon actually asked for about $80,000 in compensation, but in the end, he only got about $2,000. Pretty big difference, I guess. John Cooper of Cannon's Point went so far as to follow British ships to Bermuda. 60 enslaved people had left Cannon's Point, and like Dubignon, Cooper was seeking compensation or ultimately their return to St. Simons. Cooper may well have arrived here at Bermuda's Royal Naval Dockyard. He boarded a British vessel, the HMS Brune, and was surprised when he came face to face with Frederick, a man formerly enslaved here on the Dubignon plantation. The two recognized each other immediately, and according to a deposition John Cooper gave in 1827, Frederick immediately cried out, "That is Mr. Cooper. I wish my master was in his place. I should like to shove him down into the sea." Cooper was ultimately and unsurprisingly unable to convince anyone to come back to St. Simons or Jekyll. Nonetheless, his willingness to travel so far and to record this conversation speaks to the depth of the relationships between Jekyll and St. Simons Islanders, both personal and monetary. These relationships continued throughout both islands' plantation eras, as Georgia's coastal area remained the most highly populated and thus most lively area of the state. Social events here abounded. A great example is the Regatta of the Aquatic Club of Georgia, held in Brunswick on January 16, 1858. Henry Dubignon, the son of Anne Amelia and Henri, came in second place with his yacht, the Goddess of Liberty, only defeated by a craft that I think has a great name. It was called the Devil's Darning Needle. Participants came from Glynn and Camden counties, and they ended the event with a dinner at Brunswick's Oglethorpe House, which you can see here. This was about a 4-story hotel that stood in the same place that the Oglethorpe Hotel would eventually stand. They also enjoyed, this is a quote from a source about the event, an evening spent in the due observance of the rites and conviviality and good fellowship. This liveliness and sense of connection also contributed to our area's instrumentality during the Civil War. As the Union blockaded the newly formed Confederate States of America, citizens of Glynn County feared an invasion, much like they had during the War of 1812 several decades before. Planters on both islands abandoned their plantations and took enslaved people inland to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Union. The city of Brunswick was similarly deserted by July of 1861. Women and children fled the city, and the remaining men were instructed to burn the town if the Yankees, it was said, passed the batteries. The batteries were Jekyll and St. Simons, united in a new purpose to protect the port city of Brunswick from the nearby Union blockade ships. Both batteries were mostly completed by late 1861 and were heavily manned and armed. The Jekyll Battery reported 6 pieces of heavy artillery and a total of more than 550 men stationed on the island. The commander of the Jekyll Battery also had an important prior connection to the island. He was none other than Charles Lamar, the Savannah native who had financed the Wanderers expedition and landing on Jekyll Island less than 3 years before the battery's completion. The image on this slide is of a letter from Lamar to his father. We have 2 of these letters in the Historical Society's collections, and both of them are just a litany of complaints from Charles Lamar about how hard it is to train soldiers and to finish the construction of the battery. The St. Simons Battery, which again was positioned near the original St. Simons Lighthouse, was overseen by Carrie Wentworth Stiles, another colorful character who had served as Brunswick's mayor from 1858 to 1860. If you'll allow me an aside here, if you've been near me for more than 15 minutes, I've probably talked about Carrie Wentworth Stiles at some point. He was that very short-term mayor of Brunswick, but he earned his position because he came into town when he heard that there was a labor dispute in town, and one of the people involved in that dispute was also running for mayor. This guy was giving a talk or a lecture, and Carrie Wentworth Stiles stood up and called him a liar. The other guy called him a liar in return, and then gunfire broke out. The guy on stage died, and Carrie Wentworth Stiles became mayor. And then he went on to found a newspaper called the Atlanta Constitution. So, you know, just kind of an interesting guy. But despite their strength and manpower, the batteries were not used for long. In February of 1862, Robert E. Lee judged both batteries and Brunswick, while a Union target, were not important enough to warrant the level of protection afforded it by Jekyll and St. Simons. In a letter to Confederate States Secretary of War Judah P. Benjamin on February 10, 1862, Lee wrote, "Brunswick is a summer resort for certain planters and is the terminus of a railroad extending about 60 miles into the interior. There are no inhabitants now in Brunswick, and the planters on the islands have removed their property to the interior. Nor is there any population in the vicinity of Brunswick that would seem to warrant the men and guns necessary elsewhere. I would not, therefore, have originally occupied St. Simons or Jekyll, but the batteries, though small, are well placed, and the guns well distributed, and I think would defend the channel against ordinary attacks. I exceedingly dislike to yield an inch of territory to our enemies. They are, however, able to bring such large and powerful batteries to whatever point they please that it becomes necessary for us to concentrate our strength." Soon, the federal forces, with all the strength that Lee referred to, made their way into the Sound and onto the islands. They found both former Confederate batteries completely deserted. 3 ships, the Mohican, the Potomska, and the Pocahontas, which is seen here, anchored near the batteries, and Union troops made their way onto the islands to seize the locations. Lieutenant Henry W. Miller, aboard the Mohican, landed on Jekyll and was surprised to find no Confederate troops there to greet him. He, his scouting party, and S.W. Godin, the commander of the 3 Union ships, explored the area, even reporting just as favorably as Lee had on the potential strength of these batteries. Commander Godin wrote, "These 2 forts commanded the channel for a long distance. They would have given a number of vessels severe trouble in getting beyond them." The overall mood seemed to be relief that the batteries could be taken peaceably rather than by force. Another member of the Union forces, Commodore Samuel F. DuPont, stated that the fortifications on Jekyll were actually stronger than those on St. Simon's, but all agreed that together the 2 batteries would have been a force to be reckoned with had the Union attempted to take Brunswick. Savannah's Daily Morning News, in an article that you can see here, didn't seem very impressed with the Union effort overall. They wrote on March 10, 1862, that it is highly probable that the Yankees have won another glorious victory, no troops being there to oppose them. The area and the islands themselves would remain in Union hands for the remainder of the war. After the war, planters returned to both islands and to a vastly different world. A man named Nathaniel Bishop, who was traveling from Quebec to the Gulf of Mexico, visited John and Henry Dubignon at their home on Jekyll in 1875, and he described them as what he called lords of the forest, ruling over this completely primeval world as he saw it. But the Dubignons, like plantation owners on both St. Simon's and Jekyll, had lost a significant asset, their use of enslaved labor. Those formerly enslaved on St. Simon's tended to remain on the island after emancipation, but the majority of those formerly enslaved on Jekyll left the smaller island. To survive, both islands had to adapt. Both chose different paths. While St. Simon's brought a massive timber production industry to its shores, the Dubignon descendants who split ownership of Jekyll tried several methods of making the island profitable, at first with little success. It would take around 2 decades before John Eugene Dubignon, along with Newton Finney and John Claflin, came up with the concept that would both save Jekyll and elevate it to a new status, both here and Glynn County, and on a national, if not an international scale. The era of intermarried families and a close-knit cross-sound community had ended, and the era of the Jekyll Island Club was about to begin. The 1888 opening season of the club brought a new kind of visitor to the islands, the millionaire club members, who could afford to build the impressive cottages and new infrastructure that changed Jekyll's landscape once again. Within a few years, it seemed that both islands had suddenly realized their value as tourist destinations, albeit for very different audiences. On the south end of St. Simon's, a group of vacation homes, the Waycross Colony, which you can see here, sprang up between the St. Simon's Lighthouse and Mallory Street, where Neptune Park is today. The part-time residents of the Waycross Colony, which they named after their rest-of-the-year hometown, also called these vacation homes cottages, which I think is a description that probably fits these structures better than it fit their Jekyll Island counterparts. They were simple clapboard structures vulnerable to hurricanes, erosion, and eventually to a fire that destroyed the entire colony in the 1930s. But for several decades, they provided a beloved yearly beach experience for hundreds of people. The other significant improvement for tourists on St. Simon's was the Hotel St. Simon's, a 3-story structure built in the same year as the Jekyll Island Club's opening season. The same people that ran this hotel also ran the Oglethorpe Hotel over in Brunswick. The Oglethorpe was meant to cater to winter guests, while the St. Simon's Hotel was meant to cater to summer guests. When business slowed at one of them, the people who ran it would simply move furniture over to the other one and get ready for the next season. Before more significant erosion of the beaches on both islands, it was said that visitors to the Waycross Colony or the Hotel St. Simon's could shout from the beach near the pier and be heard by someone standing on what today is Driftwood Beach. The distance across the sound may have been small, but for a time, the islands may well have existed in 2 different worlds. The world they did share, though, still affected both, especially through shared fears, anxieties, and even declarations of war. I did mean to point out, by the way, the Hotel St. Simon's was located where Massengale Park is today. So one of my other favorite little asides is that once you had taken the train to Brunswick and then taken the steamboat over to St. Simon's, you then had to take a mule-drawn cart, or what was later a mule-drawn trolley, from the pier on St. Simon's up to the hotel. So kind of seems like a hard journey at the time. But for a short time in 1898, the United States came to the aid of Cuban nationals fighting for independence against Spain, and Jekyll and St. Simon's once again feared a Spanish invasion. Shortly before the war began, President William McKinley had been slated to visit the Jekyll Island Club. The explosion of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor postponed his trip and began a conflict that, although short, was very concerning to club members and to coastal communities. Near the St. Simons Pier, the state of Georgia positioned batteries like this one, along with a temporary encampment called Camp Gordon, meant to defend St. Simons and the Sound from the Spanish. As many as 6 companies of the 2nd North Carolina Volunteer Infantry were stationed there from the beginning of August until mid-September, though a ceasefire was signed on August 12th. By mid-September, St. Simons had completely bid farewell to the very short-lived Camp Gordon. The Jekyll Island Club, whose own founding member John Eugene Dominion had been charged with smuggling arms and ammunition to Cuba, feared invasion just like those on St. Simons. In April of 1898, club leadership permitted the U.S. Corps of Engineers to build a battery on the northern end of Jekyll to defend Brunswick Harbor. Soon, they also allowed a second battery on the southern end of the island, and you can see the remains of that battery on the left here, to protect St. Andrew's Sound. Ernest Grobe, on the right, the club's superintendent, was pleased with the decision. He wrote that the south end was where the danger really lies. Despite the urgency implied by constructing not 1 but 2 batteries on Jekyll, Grobe wasn't as worried about the invasion as many seemed to be. He even joked about the situation in his letters, where he wrote, "I am expecting every day my commission as general of the Jekyll Island troops, but I do not look for any trouble along this coast, as there are many more important towns to bombard excepting Brunswick." During the war scare, as some called it, Jekyll continued construction of its first golf course. Grobe supervised the construction, but he also kept an eye on the news. When Commodore George Dewey defeated the Spanish in the Philippines in May 1898, Grobe wrote about the event through the lens of the golf course's completion. He said, "I don't think the Spaniards will want to play golf in our yard. They will have all they can do to play with Dewey and a few others." Less than a week after Grobe wrote this letter, the federal government decided that the Spanish were no longer a threat to Jekyll Island, and both the northern and the southern batteries were removed, with some exceptions, as you can see. On St. Simons, it was said that the only real casualty of the war was the Hotel St. Simons, which was closed during the war and subsequently burned to the ground, although not for any reasons related to the Spanish-American War itself. With the construction of the golf course and the end of the war, the Jekyll Island Club was hitting its stride. The next season's business proceeded in earnest. While members of Jekyll's exclusive club prized the island's elegant simplicity, St. Simons was also becoming more of a bustling destination. Steamers from Brunswick brought new boatloads of visitors to St. Simons shores, both those who had traveled to Brunswick as a way station and those who lived in Brunswick. At the turn of the century, Brunswick itself was beginning to develop and was trying at times to sell itself as its own tourism destination. The city also knew that visitors were very interested in the islands, and newspapers published daily steamer schedules for trips to St. Simons and even to Cumberland, Fernandina, and points beyond. There was, though, an air of mystery that surrounded Jekyll, a private access island where local residents were often disallowed from landing or collecting turtle eggs, which seems to have been one of their favorite activities. Articles about the club's activities, where such information could be had, were also published in Brunswick newspapers, and local rumor had it that one particular Glynn County resident was watching Jekyll very closely. Frank Duncan McPherson Strawn, Glynn County's first millionaire, was involved in an incredible number of ventures. His father, Francis Garden Strawn, founded Savannah's Strawn Shipping Company in 1885. Like his father, FDM Strawn ran a successful shipping company, particularly for the transport of cotton and timber from local to overseas markets. He was also a real estate developer, a promoter, and head of other companies, including the local Glynn Ice Company. His business successes were well known and easily placed him in a similar economic status as the members of the Jekyll Island Club just offshore from his home in Brunswick. Strawn had built a house in Brunswick, prominently situated on Union Street, by 1902. Like many of Jekyll Island's cottages, the house was built in a Queen Anne Victorian style. But FDM Strawn was never the kind of man to forgo improvements. He expanded the house by 1915 and renovated the exterior around the same time, but only 8 years after he had built his Brunswick home in 1910, he seems to have been ready to branch out. Local legend says that Strawn applied for membership in and was rejected from the Jekyll Island Club. In revenge, the same legend says, he purchased property on the site of the former retreat plantation, close to the St. Simons Pier, and he began to build. Over nearly the next 2 decades, his property on St. Simons would grow to include his large craftsman-style house, a carriage house or garage, a storage and generating shed, servants' quarters, a bathhouse, and a cistern sometimes used as a swimming pool, all on 3 acres of land adjacent to the beach, with a perfect view of the northern end of Jekyll, which you can kind of see in the background of this photo. The entire estate was called Beach Lawn, and the same local legend concludes that Strawn made sure the lights in his St. Simons home were blazing every night to remind the nearby millionaires just how much fun he was having without them. No matter the truth of the legend, and even if Strawn's property wasn't visible from the Jekyll Island Club's riverside cottages or clubhouse, his property did sit on a site that, although on a separate island, had once been considered essential for the protection of the club itself. Strawn's property faced the Sound, and pointed across it from his lawn aimed at Jekyll Island were the remaining batteries left behind by the short-lived Camp Gordon. At one point, the cannons had been intended to protect both islands and Brunswick, but now perhaps Strawn saw them as another pointed message to the nearby but inaccessible Jekyll Island Club. FDM Strawn died in 1931, and his beach lawn house remained on St. Simons until 1986, when it was moved and gave me an opportunity to use one of my favorite pictures in our collection, all in one piece and aboard a barge, to Defusky Island, South Carolina, where it became the Hague Point Community's clubhouse. At the time of Strawn's death, the Jekyll Island Club was still in operation, but attitudes among club members and potential club members were definitely shifting. Younger potential members, the children and even grandchildren of the originals, saw the club as a Victorian relic, and they turned to different vacation destinations. Still, the club kept chugging along for more than a decade, despite declining business, until the chain of events that would end the club's ownership of Jekyll once and for all. When German submarine U-boat 123 sank 2 oil tankers, the SS Oklahoma and SS Esso Baton Rouge, on April 8, 1942, coastal Georgia knew that life in the area had changed forever. Both of these pictures are of damage to the SS Oklahoma. Of course, many locals had noted the attack on Pearl Harbor several months before, but now the war had made its incursion into daily life. On St. Simons, the Coast Guard and the Navy jumped into action, patrolling the waters and the beaches and training pilots and radar operators at Naval Air Station St. Simons and at the King and Prince. On Jekyll, the war effort was slightly quieter. Similar Coast Guard beach patrols took place here, and Army troops manned watchtowers on the island. The biggest shift for life on Jekyll, though, was the extended closure of the club. Its last season closed 3 days before that U-boat attack in 1942, and it would never truly reopen. Club leadership explored the possibility of reopening as a more commercial, more widely accessible resort, but these fell through. Frank Gould had considered funding the construction of a causeway to Jekyll, but after his death and the loss of his Jekyll bonds in 1945, the club abandoned this option. Ultimately, though, there were other plans in the works for the club and the island as a whole that would involve people and politics far beyond its shores. Back when the club first opened in 1888, an eager new club member named James F. O'Shaughnessy purchased a nearby island as a potential hunting ground. A Huntsville manufacturing millionaire, O'Shaughnessy hired a caretaker and began to stock what was then known as Long Island with game, mostly pheasants and partridges. Despite the expense of the project, though, $10,000 at the time, it didn't last long. And by 1892, O'Shaughnessy had largely abandoned the idea. Long Island was used mostly as grazing ground for livestock until the 1920s, when it was purchased by Howard Coffin, developed, and renamed Sea Island. At the time, as described by Harold H. Martin in This Happy Isle, the story of Sea Island and the Cloister, the point was strongly made that here at this new resort, the person of modest affluence could bask in the same winter sun that warmed the multimillionaires on nearby Jekyll Island. Some things have changed, huh? Sea Island borrowed some ideas from the management of the Jekyll Island Club, among them referring to its sizable vacation homes as cottages. Coffin also hired Walter Travis, the designer of Jekyll's Great Dunes Golf Course, to design Sea Island's Plantation Golf Course. By the Second World War, though, Sea Island's management had shifted in the wake of Howard Coffin's death, leaving his cousin Alfred or Bill Jones in charge of the company. At this point, Sea Island's management wasn't looking up to Jekyll. Instead, maintenance crews from Sea Island visited Jekyll on the weekends at Jekyll's request to perform landscaping and golf course maintenance. When the club closed its doors during World War II, Jones described it as, quote, a dead duck. With a new gap in the post-war vacation landscape, Sea Island made a decision. It should privatize its resources. At the time, there were facilities, beaches, a pool, and a casino building like the one on St. Simons on Sea Island that were open to the public. Sea Island wanted to charge for resources like these on a membership basis, but also felt that there should be a replacement for the resources, likely in the form of public land, beach access, and similar facilities on St. Simons. They had found, they believed, the perfect spot. Jones had bought a parcel of land, including 1,100 feet of beach, north of the King and Prince from the Massengale family for $50,000. He soon purchased another 50 acres of marsh, which he hoped to fill to provide a recreational area in the planned park. This was, he and county officials thought, the perfect solution. The park would be publicly accessible, and they believed ultimately of more value to the public than the facilities that already existed on Sea Island. Jones, county officials, and even the current governor, Ellis Arnall, who had contributed funds, gravely misjudged the reaction they would receive from locals. After a town hall meeting was held specifically to oppose the plan to build the park, Governor Arnall withdrew his funds, and Jones and the county officials were left to return to the drawing board. Soon, though, a new governor, Melvin Thompson, was in place, who suggested that the team should search for a larger site for the project. They explored several other sites on St. Simons as possibilities, but they ultimately settled on Jekyll, which Jones had been interested in for a while. He had even used its proximity to Sea Island as a selling point for Sea Island in the 1920s and 1930s. Melvin Thompson agreed that Jekyll was the best option. 3 people, Jones, then club president Vernon Prentice, and Jekyll partner Lawrence R. Condon, still owned $687,000 in Jekyll bonds, the amount for which Thompson ultimately bought the island. He met with some resistance from Condon, who didn't want to sell his bonds, but in the end, Harold H. Martin writes again, the sale went through. The state now owned Jekyll, and upcountry Georgians could see themselves at last, this is a quote from that book, settin' on Jekyll, their own descriptive phrase for the equivalent of dwelling just this side of heaven. St. Simons and Sea Island were well aware of the benefits of Jekyll's sale to their own ideas of who they wanted to become. In fact, Thompson had a specific vision of Jekyll's benefits to both Sea Island and St. Simons. The island's purchase would relieve the pressure on Sea Island to provide public facilities, and St. Simons could now advertise and appeal to retirees and others who wanted to live there year-round, leaving Jekyll open for business for short-term vacationers. The end of Melvin Thompson's term as governor and the beginning of Herman Talmadge's brought more changes for Jekyll and ultimately for St. Simons too. Growing interest in Jekyll brought more interest to Georgia's beach communities as a whole, and St. Simons was unprepared to deal with the influx of beachgoers. Beaches on the island also needed widespread improvements, more recreational facilities, picnic areas, and areas set aside for public enjoyment. Without these amenities, eager visitors were patronizing beaches at the end of previously existing neighborhood streets that led to the beach, and those that lived along those streets were none too pleased with the outcome. The Jekyll Island Causeway was completed in 1954, and 1 year later, Bill Jones resurrected his idea for a public park on the former Massengale property on St. Simons. The Sea Island Company donated 600 more feet of beach to Glynn County, and this time the park quickly became a reality. Now, again according to Harold Martin, Glynn County could offer a variety of beach enjoyment, including the state-owned Jekyll Island, the county-administered St. Simons Island, and Sea Island. Each, Bill Jones felt, had its merits, and society had need of each. Today, St. Simons and Jekyll still make up this full range of merits and of beach enjoyment. And again, I get to use one of my favorite maps, this pirate-themed one. First-time visitors to this area who ask for recommendations might find themselves on the receiving end of a thesis about which island might better suit them, which attractions to visit, and where to stay. What they might not realize is that our 2 islands' current visions of themselves and all that comes with them stem from this centuries-long tradition of comparison, support, and maybe sometimes competition. After hundreds of years of shared history, we are here, with family ties that bind us across the centuries, shared assets to protect, and maybe even the odd rivalry to nurture. We have more in common than we think, even though we may not always see it that way. Over centuries, the forces that changed our history have driven us both forward, whether we were ready for that change at the time or not. In the past, our communities may have been separated by the Sound, and by the way, whether you call it the St. Simons or the Jekyll Sound is up to you. But today, with an easy trip between us, we are in the end one community. Beaches, batteries, clubhouses, family homes, and everything in between. And if you guys will let me, I also wanted to tell you about my personal St. Simons Jekyll Island connection. So I took the job on Jekyll in January of 2021, but before that, I had actually only been to Jekyll Island one time, when I was in probably 7th or 8th grade. The biggest part of this that I remember was they had us ride bikes around the historic district, which I should have loved. I have always been the exact type of person that I am, but they gave me a bike that was too big for me. I think it was an adult's beach cruiser, and I could kind of hop onto it, but then my feet couldn't reach the bottom half of the circle when the pedal went around. So we went over some very slight hill in the historic district, and I had this like Charlie Chaplin-esque thing where the pedals completely spun out of control, and I ran into all the palmettos at the bottom of the hill. And that's like my main memory, besides staying at the old motel building that was still there at the south end of the island. But in that trip around the historic district, we must have ridden by all these buildings that I would later know really well as the museum educator, including Villa Ospo, where my office would later be, and where there would also be a kid around the same age a few years later. Some of you might recognize this guy. Later, he was an intern just across the hall in Faith Plazarid's office, where she's the archivist. And this was in the summer of 2022, and now he is the museum educator. And he absolutely hates this picture, and I love this picture. And I told him on the way over here that I would be using his 6th grade picture, and he made a sound that I would describe as pure agony. But, so now he's the museum educator. Sometimes I tell people that he has my job and is living in my house, but it's not entirely true. He is completely here on his own merits. I am so happy he's the museum educator. And we met here on Jekyll. I'm on St. Simons. We had our first date on St. Simons. And in November, we will get married up in Savannah. So that's my personal Jekyll St. Simons connection. That's the end of the historical Jekyll St. Simons connection. And I really want to thank you all for listening to me talk tonight. Thank you again.
What do you know about, or could you tell us about the brewery that Horton had? And did he not have beer sent over to Frederica?
He did have beer sent over to Frederica. The extent of what I can say about it right now is that it was the first brewery in Georgia. And if you ask Patrick when he gets back, he will be able to tell you so much more about this. He had a program a year or so ago that was called Jekyll Beer of Yesteryear, where they had kind of a recreation of what that historical beer might have tasted like. It was a really good program. Horton was growing hops and barley on the island to use at that brewery. And at the time, beer was just a lot of the time safer to drink than just the water around here. So he provided Frederica with something safe to drink. Yes?
Did Horton have slaves, or did that just come later with the juveniles?
That came later. I think one of those loyalist families, if I remember, or the Demarys, right in between. One of those were the first to have slaves on Jekyll. Horton did not have slaves here. Anyone else? Yes?
When you said that Strawn would turn all his lights on,
Mm-hmm.
so Jekyll, the good time he was having, I also heard that he fired shots to disrupt the parties that they were having.
It sounds like him. And I think there were those cannons left over from the battery at Camp Gordon, so not beyond the realm of possibility, I don't think.